Rich and rotten. My husband would humiliate me in public and make me cry for years. I was shut out of my own life. He forbade me from ever going to that art studio, but after he died, that lawyer handed me the keys. Inside that door wasn't art, but a dirty secret that destroyed who I thought I was. And what I did next shut the entire family up. The last thing I felt when Roberto's heart finally gave out was not grief, but a cold, hard sense of relief. I know how monstrous that sounds, but imagine living 7 years with an invisible chain around your neck. I, Camila, just 32 years old, was the picture of a dutiful, affluent wife in our wealthy corner of Buenos Aires. But every smile I offered Roberto in public was a performance, a repayment for a debt that felt eternal. He was constantly reminding me, always under the guise of protection, that the world was too cruel for fragile girls like me, and that only his guidance, and his money, kept my family from ruin. That was the situation, the heavy, strange reality that had been my life. His favorite tactic was the public jab, the subtle critique of my outfit or my opinion, always delivered with a charming, patronizing smirk. He wanted me small, grateful, and most importantly, quiet. His death was anticlimactic. A massive heart attack while he was alone on a business trip. No final words, no dramatic confession, just a phone call from a hotel manager. I should have been devastated, but I felt this immense, terrifying sense of lightness. I had to practice my crying face in the mirror before the funeral. I played the part of the grieving widow perfectly, accepting the condolences from his smirking sister, Elena, and his business partners who all treated me like a decorative vase he'd finally outgrown. The reading of the will a week later was the final hurdle. The atmosphere in Javier's sterile office, Javier, the lawyer, a man who always seemed to carry the weight of untold secrets, was thick with tension. Roberto had no children, and it was widely assumed everything would pass to me, and maybe a small percentage to Elena. Javier cleared his throat, reading Roberto's overly formal prose. He left me everything, the primary assets, the house, the accounts. But then Javier paused, his eyes flicking up to meet mine, holding an unnatural seriousness. And finally, Javier stated, his voice flat, to my wife, Camila, the property located at the outskirts, known simply as the studio. It is my wish that she sell this property immediately upon receipt of the title, as it holds no value and requires undue maintenance. Elena immediately snorted a laugh. The studio? What is he talking about? Roberto hated art. I was instantly intrigued and deeply unnerved. Roberto had a studio? I flashed back to a year ago, when I'd seen a strange address on his GPS history. When I innocently asked about it, he flew into a quiet, cold rage. Don't you ever, he'd hissed, his eyes dead, go near that place. It's dangerous, Camila. You are not to visit it. Ever. Do you understand? I had immediately backed down, my chest tight with fear. The prohibition had been absolute, strict, and terrifying. Now, Javier was handing me a single, heavy brass key and a clean title document. Camila, Javier said, leaning forward conspiratorially, I strongly advise you to heed Roberto's wish. Liquidate the asset. The value is negligible, and the insurance complications are not worth the effort. I felt a defiant spark ignite in my chest, a feeling I hadn't known since before I met Roberto. He controlled my clothes, my friendships, my money, and even my grief. But he was dead now. And this key, this singular, forbidden object, was suddenly mine. The curiosity was a physical ache. I looked down at the brass key, heavy and oddly shaped. I appreciate the advice, Javier, I said, my voice steady for the first time in days. But before I sell anything, I think I need to see exactly what my late husband was so determined to keep hidden from me. I saw the flicker of something, fear, perhaps, in Javier's eyes. He didn't press the issue, but the warning hung in the air, you shouldn't go there. I left the office, the key clutched tight in my palm. The luxurious life Roberto had provided felt suddenly hollow. The secret he died keeping, the only secret he'd ever truly owned, was now inviting me in. I knew, with chilling certainty, that whatever was inside that studio was going to change everything. I just didn't know if it would be for the better, or if I'd finally discover the true depths of my traition. The drive out of the city was a road trip into my own history. Every mile I traveled away from the safety of our opulent, suffocating condo, I relived the shame that had sealed my fate. Roberto had been my savior, paying off a crippling debt my parents had accrued through an ill-advised investment. I remember the sheer, paralyzing vergogna I felt when my father had to swallow his pride and beg Roberto for help. Roberto, of course, had been magnanimous, offering aid, with one condition, that I marry him. I felt obligated, responsible for my parents' financial ruin. I had no choice but to implore her for the marriage, believing I was trading my life to save theirs from public humiliation. That act of sacrifice, I realized now, was the single thread Roberto had used to weave the tapestry of my 7 years of misery. I was so convinced I owed him everything that I let him dictate who I was. As I approached the address, the city gave way to light industrial parks and then abruptly, to a quiet, tree-lined lane. The GPS announced, in its emotionless voice, that I had arrived. The atelier was a small, modern structure, sleek in dark gray, standing alone on a well-maintained patch of land. It was utterly devoid of the clutter and bohemian chaos one would expect of an artist's space. If anything, it looked like a high-tech security depot. The contrast with Roberto's description, a dangerous, filthy dive, was stark. My heart hammered against my ribs as I pulled up the gravel driveway. The air felt heavy, charged with the weight of untold history. This was the one place I was truly forbidden, the absolute line I was never to cross. Stepping out of the car, I felt like I was physically breaking a vow I couldn't even recall making. I approached the entrance. It wasn't a standard door, it was a reinforced metal slab, secured by a complex lock. I slid the heavy brass key into the tumbler. The mechanism was smooth, almost silent, suggesting regular use. A soft click echoed in the stillness. I took a deep, shaky breath, pushing the door inward. It swung open to reveal nothing. The first room was startlingly clean, cold, and spacious. White walls, concrete floors, and enormous windows that, oddly, had blackout blinds completely drawn. There was no art. No easels, no paint, no drop cloths. Just a few minimalist pieces of furniture, a stark white desk, a single leather chair, and a bookshelf that held 3 identical, anonymous hardback volumes. I almost laughed. After all the drama, all the terror he inspired, this was just an empty, pretentious meeting room. I felt a wave of foolishness wash over me. Maybe Javier was right. Maybe I should just sell it and move on. The sense of invasion began to subside, replaced by anticlimax. I walked toward the back wall, ready to leave. As I passed the bookshelf, my hand instinctively brushed one of the identical volumes. It didn't feel right. The books were fixed in place, and the entire shelf shifted slightly under my touch. My breath hitched. My hands went cold. I pushed harder, applying pressure at the top and bottom edge. The bookshelf groaned softly and swung inward, revealing a gap in the wall. Darkness pooled in the opening. This wasn't a storage closet. This was a second, hidden room. Every cell in my body screamed at me to turn around, to close the door, to drive away and never look back. But the memory of Roberto's cold, controlling gaze was a stronger force than fear. He died keeping this a secret. I had to know why. I found a wall switch, hidden discreetly next to the frame. I flipped it. The second room flooded with soft, recessed light. My eyes widened. My hands flew to my mouth, stifling a gasp. There were no more minimalist aesthetics here. The space was dominated by banks of monitors flickering in the corner, a massive, industrial-looking steel structure built into the far wall, and a dense, organized collection of metal filing cabinets. That structure wasn't a decoration. It was the door to a bank vault. A coffer. This wasn't an art studio. This was a surveillance post, a safe house, or something far more sinister. I could hear the faint, steady hum of technology, the only sound accompanying my frantic heartbeat. The sheer scale of the operation inside the hidden room was staggering. It wasn't just a vault, it was a command center. Beyond the coffer door, the walls were lined with custom-built servers, humming faintly, dedicated to information storage. Roberto hadn't been painting, he'd been cataloging the world's misery. I walked over to the desk, made of dark, polished wood, and spotted a small notepad. On it, scrawled in Roberto's distinctive, forceful handwriting, were a few numbers. My heart plummeted when I recognized the digits, my birthday. The date he always forgot to celebrate, the date he'd always belittled as unimportant, was the key to his greatest secret. The irony of his calculated cruelty made my blood boil. He made me feel worthless while simultaneously using the one day that was purely mine as his ultimate failsafe. I quickly punched the numbers into the vault's keypad. The heavy steel door released with a mechanical sigh. Inside, the light was harsher, focused entirely on organization. Shelf after shelf was filled with labeled, color-coded files and rows of encrypted hard drives. This was not a hobby. This was an empire. I pulled out the nearest physical file. The label read, Senator V. Montoro, Operations and Vulnerabilities. Inside were printouts of bank transactions, photos of clandestine meetings, phone records, and transcripts of private conversations. Everything was meticulously dated and cross-referenced. Roberto wasn't just a businessman, he was a master manipulator, a collector of secrets, a professional chantagista. He hadn't built his fortune through brilliance, he had built it on fear. My initial shock gave way to a chilling sense of clarity. The elegant dinner parties, the quiet phone calls he always took in the other room, the control over his friends' lives, it all made sense now. He wasn't protecting people, he was managing his assets. He needed me to be a perfectly boring, compliant wife to maintain his image of stability while he ruined lives in the shadows. I pulled out file after file, powerful entrepreneurs, influential judges, even prominent members of the church. The sheer volume of dirty secrets was overwhelming. I felt a wave of revulsion, but also a growing coldness. This man, this monster, was the one I had married. The man who had convinced me that I was nothing without his protection. I moved to the digital storage. A large monitor displayed a clean directory structure, financial targets, political operations, personal vulnerabilities. I started sifting through the files, searching. I knew, instinctively, that the truth about my own life had to be buried here somewhere. The great lie that bound me to him. I found a folder marked Family Assets. I clicked it, my hands shaking so violently I had to brace them on the desk. Inside, there were files on Elena and Roberto's cousins, detailing their various financial indiscretions. He even had a file on his own mother, documenting her secret gambling habit. He trusted no one. Then, at the very bottom of the directory, was a folder marked Operación Ángel Protector. Operation Guardian Angel. That was the ridiculous, pompous phrase he used when he told people he'd rescued my family. I had to brace myself for what I knew I was about to find. I was already sick with the dread of confirming my deepest suspicion. I opened the file. Inside were scans of the original loan documents and the payment records relating to my parents' catastrophic business venture. But there was also a subfolder titled Fabrication. Fabrication. When I saw the forged signatures and the correspondence with a private investigator he'd hired, detailing how to manufacture the perfect, inescapable divida for my parents, I wasn't just heartbroken, I was annihilated. The papers in the fabrication subfolder were undeniable proof. They weren't copies or suggestions, they were Roberto's meticulous notes on how to create the illusion of a colossal, urgent debt. He'd targeted my parents' failing business, introduced an accomplice, and forged the final documents that backed them into a corner. My father's signature, my mother's distress, all of it was planned. It was a perfect, calculated setup to ensure they had no choice but to push me, their sweet, dutiful Camila, into Roberto's arms. The tracing wasn't just his, it was a complicated web that involved the people I loved most, all orchestrated by the man who claimed to be my savior. I remember my body shaking so violently that the papers rattled in my hands. I slumped into Roberto's expensive leather chair, the scent of his cologne clinging faintly to the material, and finally allowed myself to shatter. I didn't just cry, I heaved. I cried for the 7 years I had wasted, for the life I believed I had to implore her for the daughter I could have been if I hadn't been drowning in manufactured guilt. He hadn't just saved me, he had engineered my servitude. I was not a woman who married for love or duty, I was a pawn purchased with a lie. The deep emotional sting was the realization of how utterly powerless I had been. My entire identity, the Camila who sacrificed everything for her family, was a costume handed to me by a master puppeteer. Every time he'd humiliated me, every time he'd made me feel stupid or dependent, he was simply reinforcing the control he paid for. That night, sitting in his secret lair, I was stripped bare. The shame wasn't about my parents' debt, the shame was realizing I had been so easily duped, so willing to believe I was nothing without him. When the tears finally subsided, a cold, empty silence filled the room. The pain coagulated into a hard, diamond-like resentment. Roberto hadn't just lied, he had stolen my life and replaced it with a hollow performance. My freedom was never going to be given to me, I would have to take it back, piece by agonizing piece. My eyes scanned the desk, now viewing his world through a lens of absolute cynicism. There had to be more. Roberto didn't just operate, he planned. He wouldn't have a massive empire of secrets without an exit strategy. I systematically went through the remaining drawers, checking every file cabinet, driven by this new, terrifying focus. I was no longer Camila the victim, I was Camila, the investigator of her own ruin. The last drawer I checked was small, tucked beneath the desk. It wasn't a file folder, but a stiff, unmarked envelope. Inside, I found a single sheet of paper with a date scrawled hastily on top, D-Day 10/05/202X. My mind flashed back, Roberto died on May 3rd. This date was a week after his death. I felt a dizzying lurch in my stomach. What was he planning for a week after his death? The question wasn't what had he been doing, but what was supposed to have happened on May 10th? Was this some sort of posthumous instruction? Was this his final, cruel joke? I was gripping the edge of the desk so tightly my knuckles were white. The air felt heavy, metallic. This wasn't just about the past, the secret was still alive, still active, lurking just beyond my understanding. The contents of the D-Day envelope were a blueprint for total erasure. It wasn't a will or a message, it was a plan. Inside were 2 crisp, meticulously detailed passports, featuring Roberto's face but with new names and birth dates. There were bank routing numbers for offshore accounts, pre-booked plane tickets to a small island nation known for its non-extradition policy, and even a list of plastic surgeons who could modify his appearance slightly. This was Roberto's ultimate escape. He hadn't just been preparing for his demise, he had been orchestrating his disappearance. I cross-referenced the dates. The whole operation was set for May 10th. The sheer audacity of it left me breathless. He was going to abandon his entire life, including me, his supposed prized possession, and vanish. But the most damning evidence was the series of recent encrypted messages and reports. I downloaded the data from the hard drives and found a chronology of events leading up to his trip. Roberto's most powerful victim, a man named Armando, had finally closed in. Armando had discovered the extent of Roberto's surveillance and, critically, his plan to flee. Roberto's internal notes, written in a panic, detailed the escalating threats. He knew he was running out of time before Armando destroyed him. Then I pulled up the official medical report of Roberto's death. Cause of death, massive coronary event. No foul play suspected. The date, May 3rd. The pieces clicked together with a sickening finality. Roberto hadn't died of a heart attack. He hadn't made it to his planned escape date. He was assassinated. Armando, realizing Roberto was about to disappear and take all the secrets with him, had acted first. It wasn't a sudden, tragic natural death, it was a targeted, clinical elimination, perfectly disguised. The hotel room, the timing, the lack of an autopsy, all covered by Armando's influential connections. Roberto, the master manipulator, was hoisted by his own petard. I stared at the name scrawled on the last page of the D-Day file, the name of the man who killed my husband, who accidentally freed me, Armando Vega. The name meant nothing to me, just another suit in Roberto's orbit. Yet, this man was my true liberator. A strange feeling washed over me. I felt no grief for Roberto, and certainly no desire for vengeance against Armando. The man who had supposedly loved and protected me had been planning to expel me from his life anyway, leaving me a widow but still bound by the fabricated debt and shame. The man who killed Roberto was, in a twisted, terrible way, the one who severed the last link in my chain. I could walk into a police station right now. I could hand over the D-Day file and the evidence against Armando Vega. I could expose the murder, the chantagista, the lies, the traition. I could have justice. I could finally be a true, honest victim. But the thought felt sterile. What would I gain? A few minutes of shock on the news, followed by the complete destruction of my reputation as the wife of a criminal mastermind. I would lose the house, the money, and face years of legal scrutiny. I would be back to zero, maybe even worse, having to implore the courts for leniency. I looked at the mountain of secrets surrounding me. This wasn't just a discovery, it was a massive, dark inheritance. Roberto, in his selfishness, had left me the keys to an empire. I had been given a choice, a horrifying, beautiful moral vacuum. Would I choose justice, or would I choose power? Would I be the good, innocent Camila, or something else entirely? A slow, dangerous smile crept onto my face. I didn't weep again, and I didn't panic. The discovery of the murder, the realization that Roberto's death was a violent act of vengeance, had somehow neutralized my remaining fear. It was a macabre kind of freedom. I sat there in the silence, processing the sheer volume of manipulation and the immense power now resting in my hands. The idea of reporting Armando, of seeking justice, felt absurdly naive. Justice wouldn't give me back the 7 years I lost, nor would it erase the vergogna Roberto inflicted. It would just exchange a golden cage for a legal battlefield. No, Roberto didn't just make me his victim, he unwittingly armed me. By forcing me to live a life of performance and control, he had taught me how to read the room, how to observe the hidden flaws, and how to execute a plan with a perfect, calm exterior. My old life was gone. The moment I opened the door to the atelier, Camila the victim ceased to exist. In her place, a new, colder creature began to stir. My goal was no longer to mourn or to seek external approval. It was to reclaim every stolen moment, every humiliation, every tear he made me cry. And the only currency that mattered in Roberto's world was power. I would use his own architecture of secrets to destroy everyone who had benefited from my misery, and I would emerge not as the innocent widow, but as the silent controller. I would choose power over purity. I chose to become the monster Roberto had unknowingly cultivated. I picked up the file containing the forgery of my parents' debt. This was where the vengeance would begin, a quiet, surgical strike. My parents still lived with the manufactured sense of obligation, still walking on eggshells around the ghost of Roberto's generosity. I wouldn't tell them the truth directly, they were too fragile. I would give them their freedom by destroying the lie, and in doing so, free myself from their lingering guilt. The hardest decision was what to do with the murder file. I took the document with Armando Vega's name and the escape plan, tucking it securely into a separate, fireproof safe I found built into the floor. It was my ultimate insurance policy. If I ever needed to disappear, or if someone threatened my new empire, that file was my nuclear option. But for now, Armando Vega was simply the man who had done my dirty work for me. His freedom was my freedom. His secret was my shield. My immediate focus turned to Javier, the lawyer. He was Roberto's confidant and enforcer. He knew more than he let on, and his nervous urgency to sell the atelier proved his complicity. To access Roberto's finances and begin my plan, I needed Javier as an unwitting accomplice, not an enemy. I found my phone on the desk, the small light illuminating my reflection on the screen. I barely recognized the woman staring back. Her eyes were colder, harder, completely devoid of the old fear. I dialed Javier's office number. "Javier," I said, my voice low and steady, a new authority settling in the tone. "I've been going through some of Roberto's papers. It's more complicated than I thought. I need to schedule a meeting first thing tomorrow morning to discuss the liquidation of the assets. Bring the complete financial audit, including the private investment portfolio. I need to understand what exactly I'm selling." Javier sounded surprised, almost stammering. "Of course, Camila. But why the private portfolio?" I paused, letting the silence stretch, conveying a silent warning. "Because, Javier," I replied, a hint of steel in my voice, "I intend to sell everything that can't be protected." I hung up before he could respond, leaving him to wonder exactly what I now knew. The game had begun. The next day, sitting across from Javier, I felt like a spy in my own life. He was defensive, sweating slightly, trying to maintain his professional facade while clearly unnerved by my sudden change in demeanor. I had worn a simple, severe black dress, no hint of the pastel, demure look Roberto preferred. "So, the studio," Javier began, tapping his pen nervously on the desk. "Have you initiated the sale process?" "I can handle the real estate agent." "Not yet," I said, placing the brass key on the polished mahogany between us. It was a deliberate display of power. "It's not an art studio, Javier. It's a server farm. A storage facility. I've found some interesting documents regarding Senator Montoro and others. Tell me, how much of Roberto's business were you actually managing?" Javier's face went white. He opened his mouth to deny it, but I didn't give him the chance. "Don't bother denying it. I saw the communication logs. You were his point of contact for the overseas transactions. Now, we have a choice. You can either become my problem, or you can become my solution. You've been traicionado too, Javier. Roberto was planning to leave you holding the bag of secrets while he fled to the Caribbean." I slid the private investment audit across the desk. "Let's start here. This fund. It's listed as a primary investment, but I know, from the files, that it's actually a vulnerability for Elena, Roberto's sister. She has millions tied up in highly leveraged assets in the same fund, believing it's safe. Roberto was manipulating her, keeping her just close enough to control, just poor enough to despise me." Javier stared at the documents, then at me. The fear in his eyes had morphed into grudging respect, or perhaps terror. "What are you suggesting, Camila?" he whispered. "I'm suggesting we manage the risk," I replied, leaning in. "Elena has always treated me like I was beneath her, the gold digger who replaced her status as Roberto's favorite. My first move will be a simple, surgical liquidation. We're going to anonymously leak a small, truthful piece of information about this fund's instability to a financial blog. A tiny panic will follow. Elena won't lose everything, but she will suffer a significant, public embarrassment and a devastating financial hit. It will look like a business failure, a market correction. And it will destroy her carefully curated facade." Javier swallowed hard. "This is dangerous. Highly illegal." "It's just damage control, Javier," I said, my voice devoid of emotion. "Roberto already committed the crime. We're just managing the consequences. Now, are you with me? Or do you want me to call the police and show them the files detailing your involvement in an international money laundering scheme? I know the truth about your offshore accounts, Javier. The choice is yours." Defeated, Javier nodded slowly. "I'm with you, Camila. Tell me what to do." I felt a surge of cold triumph. The first night was now on my side of the board. I dismissed Javier with instructions to begin the anonymous leak. Later that evening, I made a detour to my parents' small, humble apartment. I brought them flowers and a beautifully wrapped, hefty check, the balance of which covered the exact, fictional amount Roberto had paid for their debt. "Mama, Papa," I said, feigning affection, "I've been going over Roberto's papers. I found that he had a life insurance policy I didn't know about. I want you to take this. Pay off the last of your bills. You are free." My mother wept with relief, pulling me into a hug. My father, ashamed to look me in the eye, mumbled his gratitude. I smiled, a small, genuine smile. They were free of the debt, finally. But the sweet vergonha of the full, ugly truth was still waiting in the wings. I knew I couldn't protect them from that forever, but for now, I had destroyed the physical chain. The anonymous leak worked exactly as planned. Within 48 hours, the financial blog post created a ripple, and Elena's over-leveraged investment fund suffered a brutal hit. She didn't know it was me, of course. She believed it was a ruthless market movement, perhaps engineered by one of Roberto's rivals. The best part? She immediately suspected her own husband, Carlos. I watched the unfolding drama from a distance, Javier feeding me updates with a growing sense of nervous complicity. He was terrified of me, but he was also addicted to the thrill of maneuvering Roberto's dark empire. I was using the information to create strategic, believable chaos. I didn't need to threaten anyone, I just needed to show them the trap Roberto had already set. Elena, desperate to save face and her fortune, called me hysterical. "Camila, you have to help me. Carlos has been acting strangely. He was always jealous of Roberto, you know, always trying to get a share of the bigger deals. I think he leaked the information to sabotage me. You're the only one who knows the business now, the only one who can talk to Roberto's old contacts. Please, I implore you, help me find out who did this." I listened, my expression a mask of sympathy. My sister-in-law, who had spent years treating me like a glorified housemaid, was now humilhada and begging for my assistance, all while falsely accusing her own husband. "Of course, Elena," I cooed, using the soothing, passive voice she was used to hearing. "I'll look into Roberto's files. We'll find out who traicionó you." That night, I went back to the atelier. I located the file on Carlos. It was full of juicy details, a small, secret gambling addiction, and a history of embezzlement from a former company. Roberto had been saving it for a rainy day. I gave Javier instructions to leak a tiny bit of this information, not the gambling, but a hint of the embezzlement, to a secondary source, framed as part of the initial investigation into the fund collapse. The seeds of suspicion had been planted, now, I was watering them. Within a week, Carlos was facing an internal investigation at his firm, and Elena was demanding a separation. The whole family was tearing itself apart, blinded by suspicion and greed, all thanks to the dominoes I had set falling. My next target was an old business partner of Roberto's, a man named Esteban, who had once tried to sexually harass me at a party, only for Roberto to publicly shut me down instead of Esteban, warning me never to cause a scene. Roberto had a full dossier on Esteban's tax evasion. I didn't leak it. I did something much more subtle. I had Javier call Esteban and, using an old, coded threat phrase from Roberto's notes, inform him that the insurance policy on his tax records was about to expire. Esteban panicked and, convinced Roberto was somehow pulling the strings from beyond the grave, frantically moved his assets, triggering an automatic flag with a regulatory body. No direct threat from me, just a gentle push toward the edge of the cliff Roberto had already prepared for him. I was operating with surgical precision. There was no anger, only focus. I was rebuilding my sense of self on a foundation of vengeance. I was no longer the woman who had to implore for mercy, I was the one who granted or withheld it. The woman who made everyone else cry. The only person I truly felt I needed to confront was the original object of my vergonha, my father. He had to know the truth about the debt. Not for his sake, but for mine. I needed to excise the lie that held me captive. I arranged a dinner at my house, the house that Roberto bought, the stage of my gilded imprisonment. My parents arrived for dinner, cautious and appreciative, still reeling from the unexpected financial gift. The atmosphere was strained. My father, in particular, kept glancing at the portrait of Roberto hanging in the study, a habit of deference that made my skin crawl. "Papa," I started, setting down my glass of wine. "I need to talk to you about the debt. The one Roberto paid." His face paled instantly. "Camila, please. It's done. We are so grateful. We are forever in his debt, may you rest in peace." "He may," I said, letting a sliver of my new, cold voice show. "But you are not. You never were." I stood up and walked to a nearby safe, not Roberto's main vault, but one I now controlled, and pulled out the folder marked fabrication. I slid the files across the table, the original forged documents, Roberto's manipulative notes, the whole sickening plan. The debt, Papa, was a lie. A beautiful, tragic lie. Roberto forged the documents, pressured your partners, and trapped you. He didn't save you, he bought me. My mother gasped, but my father simply stared at the papers, his aged hands trembling. The vergonha on his face was crushing, overwhelming. It wasn't the shame of debt, it was the shame of having traded his daughter for a lie. He tried to speak, to implore her for my forgiveness, but no sound came out. "I don't need your apology, Papa," I cut him off, my voice steady. "I need you to know the truth so that I can finally be expulsa from the shadow of this marriage. You don't owe Roberto anything. You only owe me the truth about why you didn't fight back harder." That night, I got my answer, a tearful, heartbreaking confession of their own desperation and fear. When they finally left, my parents were utterly broken, but I felt a strange sense of equilibrium. The shame was transferred from me back to its original source. I had won the moral war, even if I was about to dive into the ethical abyss. The next day, I met Javier at the atelier. He was twitchy, but obedient. The chaos in Roberto's circle was reaching a fever pitch, Elena was demanding investigations, Esteban was panicking, and the entire structure of the elite was starting to crack. "Javier," I said, leading him into the secret office. "It's time for you to become a full partner. I need you to understand exactly what you're protecting." I pulled out the folder with Armando Vega's name. I showed him the assassination plan, the forged travel documents, and the evidence that Roberto was murdered. Javier was paralyzed. He was killed, Javier. Right before he was going to abandon all of us and your family. Javier realized the full extent of Roberto's traition, not just to me, but to him. The terror was replaced by cold fury. "What do we do?" "We have to report this monster, Armando," he stammered. I smiled, a thin, chilling expression. "No, Javier. We don't. We use it. Armando Vega is a problem that solves itself. For now, he is our ultimate secret weapon. He is the reason no one will ever look too closely at Roberto's death, or at the existence of this studio. Your job is to make sure the money keeps flowing, and my job is to make sure the secrets stay buried." I then presented him with the final hand, a complete breakdown of how we would use the existing network to consolidate power, turning the Chantagistas operation into an anonymous, legitimate-looking investment portfolio, mine. He had no choice but to agree. I had trapped him, but I had also empowered him. The decision was final. I stood in the secret room one last time, looking at the small, fireproof safe containing the evidence that could put Armando Vega away for murder. I had spent weeks in this room, transforming from a desperate housewife into a cold, ruthless strategist. The fear was gone. The tears were gone. What was left was an immense, terrifying capability. Armando Vega had killed Roberto and, in doing so, had freed me. If I exposed him now, the resulting investigation would unravel Roberto's entire network. The studio would be raided, the secret files would be public, and my multi-million-dollar inheritance, built entirely on Segredos and Traco, would vanish. I would be back where I started, poor, disgraced, and utterly powerless, having to implore the legal system for scraps. I was no longer interested in moral victories. I was interested in surviving and winning. Roberto had taught me that in the world of the elite, power is the only true currency, and the biggest secret is the ultimate shield. My power was the knowledge that Roberto was a dead chantagista and that his killer was walking free, entirely unaware that I held his life in my hands. I took the file out of the safe. I carried it across the room to the small, industrial incinerator unit Roberto used to destroy sensitive paper trails. I didn't hesitate. I dropped the file, the definitive proof of Roberto's murder, into the flames. The paper curled, the ink bubbled, and the name Armando Vega turned to ash. I watched the smoke curl toward the ventilation system, a silent sacrifice of justice for power. I had effectively guaranteed Armando Vega's freedom, because his secret guaranteed mine. Over the next few months, I executed the rest of my plan. I sold the big house, the Gaiola Dorada, and used the profits to liquidate all the legitimate assets. Javier worked diligently to convert the money flow from Roberto's Chantagista network into anonymous, overseas investments under my new holding company. Elena's family was financially ruined, and Carlos was facing serious charges. Esteban went bankrupt trying to evade a tax investigation that only I knew was entirely a self-inflicted wound. They all destroyed each other, looking for a scapegoat that they couldn't find, utterly unaware that the quiet, submissive widow was the one pulling the strings. My parents? They are doing fine. They never asked about the debt again. They simply believe I am a brilliant, shrewd businesswoman, exactly the image I've now crafted. Today, I live on the coast of Spain, running my own foundation dedicated to empowering women, a foundation, ironically, funded by the profits of Roberto's dark empire. I am financially untouchable, emotionally impenetrable, and utterly free. I look out at the ocean, sipping my morning coffee, and I think of Roberto. He tried to make me small, but he left me the tools to become monumental. The greatest illustration of all was the lie he told about the debt. The most satisfactory part is that his killer walks free because I am the one who benefited most from the crime. I did not seek justice for my husband's murder. I chose to inherit his power, leaving the public revolted by my cold, calculated survival. The quiet, grieving widow is gone. I am Camila, the collector of secrets. And my life, now, is finally mine. So, that's my story. I chose power over purity, and look where it got me. Tell me honestly, if you were in that room, holding the keys to utter ruin and absolute freedom, what would you have burned? Drop a comment and tell me what you think of my choice.